Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo. I'm the founding partner at NextYear. NextYear is a multi-competency advisory firm and a capital mobilization firm focused on addressing Africa's most complex development challenges. And one of those challenges is the birth of Nigeria. Nigeria was assembled in 1914 by colonial fiat, yeah? And from that act of administrative convenience, administrative geography, this country has spent more than a century arguing over whether it can become a nation. One of our leaders, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, called it a mere geographic expression, borrowing that phrase from Metternich, who had used it to describe Italy. But you see, a century later, Italy became a nation. Yeah. So the question we sit with today is whether plurality is the obstacle to becoming, or the material form, or the material from which a nation can be built. My guest has spent his life inside this particular question. Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka, you're welcome to Development Discourse.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. And keep up the good work. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now, you've spent your life inside the Nigeria argument over difference. When you use the word plurality, what do you mean that diversity does not capture? You know, when you use the word plurality, what does that word mean to you that diversity does not capture?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we want many things in plural. You know, it's better to have 3 shirts than to have one. It's better to have, so yes, naturally, it's better to have 1,000 naira than to have 200 naira. So
Yeah.
ordinarily, but I think the crucial point is the management. So I think that there are no intrinsic arguments for us to make over the fact that pluralism necessarily is a bad thing. Many people say that Somalia literally belong to one ethnic group and that yet they are still one of the most chaotic
country
today. So I think critical to this conversation is the whole question of utility. How do we manage and how do we make pluralism something effective, but also something useful for celebrating who we are?
Because the way I look at it is that diversity is like a fact. You know, there's diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, whatever you may call it. But when I think about plurality, I see it as a construct, as something that our structure or choices we've made have kind of defined for us. So is plurality dangerous because it exists, or because the elite find it useful in their political calculation?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it is the instrumentalization of identity, of pluralism. It's instrumentalization. And the instrumentalization didn't happen before then. I mean, the social structures of our societies were such that these realities existed. How did men manage relationships with women, for example? How did older people manage relationships with younger people? How did poor people manage relationships with richer people? So, I mean, so the structural forms are always there. And because the very moment that, you know, if you are a Christian, from the Bible itself, the first act of murder happened, you know, between the 2 children of Adam and Eve. So, and it's always in relation to contestation for something. You know, if we are just all having a party and having a great time and everybody is having a good time, everybody has a seat at the table, there will be no conflict. So I think the most important thing to understand is these conflicts happen, but in relation to what?
Mm.
And I think that if you bring in the elite part of component of the conversation, it is going to come down to competition for what the economists refer to as scarce resources. So
Mm-hmm.
the competition for opportunity, the competition for privilege, these are natural human instincts. And the reason why the state exists is to serve as a regulator of human conduct and behavior. Imagine if people got into boxing. And in those days, when people were boxing, you literally fought until you dropped. In the same way
Mm-hmm.
that when we started playing football as a kid in my little village, we will just gather with our cousins and then choose a middle place and start playing. Whenever we couldn't find the ball, we just took we thought about victory when the sun set. And then rules and regulations have come in and so on. So I think really you manage pluralism or plurality or diversity, whatever word you may choose to use, if you have a capacity to regulate opportunities and conduct and so on and so forth. So in a society like ours, these things have become weapons because of the weakness of the legal structure to manage these identities. But by themselves, my argument is that plurality or pluralism or diversity, these are assets, not necessarily weapons of antagonism as we tend to present them.
Mm, mm. And we'll come to that point. But I want to go back again. In my intro, I talked about Lugard, the 1914 amalgamation, and how it assumed that the North and the South would remain administrative districts under the crown. Yeah. What did that founding architecture freeze in place? What did it foreclose for us? And I'm asking this question to see if there are things that were frozen in time that we may have an opportunity to unlock. Because we are humans, we have agency, we should be able to unlock some things that may have gone wrong in the design.
For me, it's not the assumptions we have about 1914, the assumptions we have about our independence, the assumptions we have about what was discovered in Nigeria in terms of intention of the colonial state and so on. All of these things have been unpacked in that book. And it will be, I mean, it literally shook me when I read it. Let me put it that way. So there are, in my view, I think Nigeria's history is still partly written in a hurry, but we haven't had the patience to go back to the crime scene, to pick up the pieces of how we ended up where we are. We just feel that something is wrong. But instead of understanding the causal factors, our focus has been that somehow something is wrong with us. And of course, many people say, oh, it's the black skin. People will say, oh, it's the state of, that is how we are. So my take about Nigeria is that we need to be a little bit more modest because we didn't have a situation in which people sat down together and decided they wanted to have a country that we now call Nigeria. That we were literally spectators in a game that was written outside our environment, and all we've had to do is to manage to see how best we can make of what this country is. But we're not like the United States of America, we're not like other countries that decided this is what we wanted to do. So unless you return to that foundation, so to say, it will be difficult, to appreciate the challenges and the difficulties that remain with us up till today.
So you broke up a little bit when you were talking about the book. Your internet broke up a bit. So were you referring to Formations by Seyi Fahemi?
No. This is a book written by Dele Ogun. Dele Ogun is a lawyer. He's based
Okay.
in London.
Yes.
So now he's written this book, which I think every Nigerian really ought to read. The title of the book is Culprits. And he's able to assemble painstakingly data to justify, to validate almost all the arguments that he has made, which actually leads to the conclusion that what we call modern Nigeria is a fraud. And it's not as if you have to agree with everything, but there is empirical evidence, to show that we are not where we are now purely by mistake. And I think that when you look at that kind of a narrative, you won't feel sorry for us as Nigerians for where we are. But I think you can understand the reason why things have been so slow in coming together. So for me, that is really part of the issues. Because when we talk about, like I said, we're not talking about founding fathers like people who sat down together and say, wouldn't it be nice for us to sit down together and agree to do this, that, and the other? The 920 or so thousand kilometers that make up Nigeria is what the British cut and gave to us. There's very little we can do about that. The argument about Bakassi, the argument about boundaries between Sokoto, Niger, or between Togo, and all of these things are part of the construction that was outside our power. So in managing what we now call plurality and how and why it became a problem, it is that you will see that the colonial administration also thrived in this division, it's sowing the seeds, because Nigeria was literally three different countries. So I'm saying that if we understand this context, we will not excuse ourselves, but we can understand why this journey to greatness has been a little bit slow.
Interesting. Maybe one more question on our history. Is there a moment in Nigeria's constitutional history when, if we made a different choice, we could have produced a different country? From your read of our history, if so, when?
Well, I think you have to go back to the anecdotal thing about Nnamdi Azikiwe saying to the Sandona, let us. I mean, it's largely anecdotal. I don't know whether it is true, but I think it speaks to the issue. Namely, okay, let us sink our differences so we can build a great country. The Sandona says, no, let us understand our differences. And for me, that is a fundamental take-off point to where the road began to diverge. Because then as now, very little has changed. We are still debating, for example, after 60 years of independence, we're still debating a situation where the North is literally saying, believing under Islamic law, and that there are many people who react to democracy as if it is a bit of a nuisance. We are still having a situation where people are debating that my sacred text is more important than the Nigerian constitution. And we didn't resolve those issues. And we very quickly moved on. And of course, as you know, the military intervening barely 6 years later. I believe that perhaps we would have had the mechanics and mechanism of resolving these problems, in part because the British left us a fantastic set of technocrats, with a bureaucracy that was not perfect, but it had all the instruments to be able to build a good society. India stuck with that bureaucracy. Singapore stuck with that bureaucracy. There's no country in the world today. Let's even go to Asia. All they talk about Asian tigers and so on. Truth be told, I always say to Nigerians, because Nigerians like to say, can you imagine the Malaysians came and borrowed palm
oil?
Yeah. I always say to them, the Malaysians didn't have a military coup. And they say, why are we not like Singapore? Well, Singapore never had a military coup. So if you want to understand how this country has become so dysfunctional and not really functioning, it is to go back to the crime scene. And in my view, whatever anybody may have to say, this is my conviction, I may be wrong, but I believe that January 15, 1966 is the crime scene, because that's when this confusion set in. And then the successive overstay of the military literally denied us the opportunity that we needed, to set ourselves and our country on a path. Because in between that period, ethnicity became important and very pronounced. Religious identity and identification became very pronounced. Opportunities, then the military mistakenly began to go into states creation. And states are created, they weren't created because we scientifically thought this was the right thing to do. It was primarily to stop Ojukwu from going to war. And then subsequently, the Nigerian state just became something that was balkanized by the elite. So today, people will tell you, I'm the one who got this state created. So you can correlate even the volatility of the Nigerian state today with those policy decisions.
It seems to me that you're arguing that state creation then deepened and solidified the plurality we see in Nigeria today.
There are two factors. The first, yes, that you got me right. Because ask yourself, which other British colony has created states? Which other country in Africa has states? Okay, the Asians don't have, India doesn't have states. Many of these places have provinces. And if you look at the ethnography, the British did a fantastic job when they created those provinces. Now, unfortunately for us, because many of these colonial civil servants were largely from Oxford and Cambridge, as you know very well, we now have ended up with a situation in which the splitting of the state. First of all, you had the privatization of the Nigerian state, especially under the military, which then became ours to give us to whom we wanted. So 774 local governments are created rather arbitrarily. And a lot of the tension and conflict that still exists in Nigeria today, those tensions are related to where did you cite the capital of our local government. You will find that somebody who was an outsider in the community, but was either military opportunity or privilege or had contacts with Abuja, were given a local government and given the headquarters. So
as a gift.
Yes, as a gift. So again, that's why I'm saying we need to understand the reason why, as we say in Nigeria, Nigeria has become one kind. Nothing wrong with the people, but we are navigating with tools that we didn't design ourselves. So for me, that would be the first. The second point is that every time you created a state, for example, a majority became a man. I mean, yesterday's minority becomes today's majority. And then the volatility begins all over again. And you can see from the reaction after the 12 states, the 19 states, with the creation of, let's say, from Anambra, from Imo, with the creation of Anambra, and when you had those two states, imagine how people reacted once you created Ebonyi, you created Enugu, we are cases of people literally throwing off, tenants and so on, using the same language by just saying, go home, you are no longer part of us. So every time we created a new state or expanded the political space, we dug a hole to fill a hole. The second point which I want to make is the persistence and what I call the intrusion of non-state institutions like the traditional institutions. Nigeria is the only country where you can still say that we are, here we are. The very fact that you have your own chief means that you and I are not the same. All right? So now there is this ubiquity of traditional institutions and traditional rulers all over the place. Again, go back to Asia and ask yourself, how did the Indians, how did the Asians resolve the issue of the role and place of traditional institutions? Now, look at the revolution in France and look at the emergence of democracy in Europe. All of those things happen over the graves of feudalism. But we are still pretending today. And you, Patrick, you can only be a citizen in Abuja. You're only a citizen in Abuja. But when you go back to your community, whether the man sitting at the back there has gone to school or not gone to school, you are not expected to shake his hands. You are supposed to fall prostrate. So all of these things have created points of new identities. Every time you create a new chiefdom or a new traditional institution, yesterday's brothers suddenly become today's enemy. So in my view, and for a country that is not economically expanding, so we're like somebody living in a little house and we're bringing in more children and more children and more children, there is bound to be a constriction of space. The result is conflict and violence. So I think there could have been more scientific ways of resolving the issues of how we've managed our pluralism. Every time we've tried to solve a problem, we've created another problem.
So you've made an interesting, almost intriguing argument about traditional institutions. Somebody on the side could also say the same about religious institutions. That
Absolutely.
The position, okay, how would you respond to that? That the same honor and prestige and exaltation we give to traditional institutions is the same we give to religious institutions, and that maybe we should just become a confessional state and rid ourselves of all forms of religion becomes private practice.
You see, look, this is I am 50 years a priest this year in December, so I'm not a stranger to this conversation. Now, for me, it's not about respect or lack of respect. It is that when we start talking about the whole question of what did America do with the 13th Amendment, some people were slaves. Okay, slavery was legal. But then the 13th Amendment, no, we have to abolish slavery. It didn't end the conditions, but at least you could know a boy. Okay, now the 14th Amendment in the American Constitution enabled people to claim their rights as citizens. All right. So the point I'm making is that I totally agree with you. But the French Revolution was also about, and as you know very well, the Catholic Church was very much a victim. But I'm also saying it must be the point that I, as bishop or whatever, am primarily a citizen. Everybody should be entitled to respect. And there is a sense in which, of course, if the traditional institutions were largely related to their own spaces and so on, even though the claims of the Nigerian constitution is that we are all citizens. So whether it's, and I'm not talking about respect or lack of respect, no, I'm talking about what are the ingredients that constitute a democratic state. It is the assumption that all of us approach the throne at equal levels. So whether it's as a bishop or as a traditional ruler, I actually should be subordinated to the constitution and also given my respect, but not to think about a space in the political structure, because these are issues that we haven't resolved, and the issues are difficult to resolve because presidents are holding traditional titles, governors are holding traditional titles. So if you are holding a traditional ruler title as a president or as a governor, how does that sit with the people that are, because when you get to the palace of your traditional ruler, are you still a governor of the state? Yes, you may be. And in his palace, you are a subject. I remember I was in the US when I think it was Reagan that was in power then. When Reagan was going to come to the UK, there were stories that Reagan was going to be given a knighthood. And the Americans said, you take a knighthood, you won't cross the Atlantic.
Yeah.
You also remember that when Obama visited Egypt, the very fact that Obama put his head down to greet, I think it was Mubarak or so, Americans found that offensive. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking here about respect or lack of respect. No, I'm saying that if we're trying to build a democracy, we cannot be selective. We cannot pretend that there is something about Africa that is not favorable for democracy to grow. So a combination of the factors of feudalism, along with the divisiveness engineered by the creation of states, more local government, means that citizens have too many competing areas of allegiance. This is why when you talk about unity in Nigeria, we can only be united when we are watching the Super Eagles. So, and of course, the myth of unity comes from a deliberate decision by a country to choose, is it a constitution? Is it a model? Americans, for example, who say, we came about, we're a city on the hill. Their currency is in God we trust. And the place of God in American politics was pretty clear. And it's still so today. But at the end of the day, it is being an American citizen that is more important than any other thing else.
Sure. So in Nigeria, we typically look at religion as a fault line. Yeah. But in your work, and again, in the work of the Kuka Center, you've positioned religion as a bridge, even your work at the Vatican, etc. Under what conditions does religion become a bridge? And how do we expand those conditions so that we see more of that in our relationships within Nigeria?
Religion only responds to, let me use the word, a vacuum. Let me put it that way. Because at the end of the day, let's say, for example, when Nigeria was under the military, with all sense of modesty, people like myself and a lot of other people became very, 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 very active because we gave the Nigerian citizens agency.
Yes.
When apartheid was on in South Africa, the church stepped in. The church gave the ordinary people of South Africa agency and voice. The same thing in the Philippines. The same thing leading to the collapse of communism, beginning from Poland and other countries. So the role of religion is always largely tentative. This is not to say its role in our personal lives is not. No, it is important. And I think this is where even religious leaders must understand the boundaries, which is what I'm really saying, must understand those boundaries. But the reason why religion is ubiquitous in the Nigerian situation, it is that it has become actually the alternative to the state. Because the absence of the state has created a condition in which the average Nigerian citizen today his allegiance is to the church, in part because the church has helped him to get water, to get education, to get a lot of other things. So it is that the role of religion and the role of tradition, most of these must be subordinated to the larger, not a substitute, to the duty and responsibility of the state. So, and this is why you are finding religion literally being co-opted. The state will always try to find religious leaders it can co-opt. So the business of religion and religious leaders is to remain at the portal, negotiate and serve as a bridge, as you rightly said. But again, you serve as a midwife, which means that you must have an idea about when to hand over the baby and go back to where you are and let the state play its role.
Let me push this a bit. So, Bishop, with all sense of modesty, you're a very dynamic person. You're very progressive. The Sultan is too. Is there no basis, no framework under which that can work?
From where we come, the Sultan and I have actually no differences in terms of what needs to be done in our country. But the point I'm making is, don't make me a substitute. Okay? Don't make me a substitute for the obligations that the Nigerian state owes to you.
Even when the Nigerian state has proven that it cannot play that role, shouldn't we be looking for alternatives?
Well, no. Okay, Patrick, if it turns out, for example, let's say, how will I put it? You are the one who is married. Your father-in-law can decide he wants to take his daughter away because whatever reason he may have. It is your responsibility to say to him, no, you can't do that because this is my home. What I'm saying is that the Nigerian state, let's not take the default position that let's not define this role by what the Nigerian state is not doing. It is that it's not doing, but at the end of the day, it is our responsibility collectively as citizens to compel the state to do what it ought to do.
Even when 63% of us are multidimensionally poor, we can't think straight. 7 out of 10 Nigerians cannot think straight. And we still want them to take on the responsibility of holding the state to account. Is that not shifting responsibilities from people like yourself, the Sultan, and the people who should be able to think for the 7 out of 10 who cannot think?
If there are problems that you have and you cannot talk, I can lend you my voice. I don't think it is correct to say that there are Nigerians who cannot think or that we are. I think the problem here is we like to outsource obligations and responsibilities. So Bishop Kuka can be speaking out. I travel around Nigeria a lot. And people say to me, oh, Bishop, they tell me at the airport, on the streets, everywhere I go. People are saying, Bishop, we thank you so very much. You are speaking for us. And the first thing I say to them, please, no, I'm not speaking for you. I'm speaking for myself. All right? I cannot, there is a saying in Hausa, don't borrow my mouth to eat onions. You cannot. The Nigerians like to think that this change is going to happen because somehow other people are doing it on our behalf. And that is the mistake that we make. The point to make is those we consider to be uneducated and they cannot think, and I'm sure you will take back that expression.
Let me explain it, Bishop. What I mean is, okay.
No, Patrick, let me explain what I'm saying.
Okay.
When you say somebody cannot think, and when Nigerians say that you are uneducated, when our people decided to resist British colonialism, what did they have? They weren't in school. They didn't come out of school. What has happened is that we have a severely compromised elite, including myself and yourself, okay, who are making peace with a state that is probably not sufficiently functional, but refusing to interrogate these distortions and focusing more on the opportunities and privileges that are available to us. Now, we all have a duty, but the point to make is that I cannot substitute the duty and responsibility of the people that are with me by assuming that I'm going to be their spokesman. Everybody should just go to bed. So we have lost a sense of shame collectively. But I'm also saying that to move the needle, it's not enough to say, Sultan, please speak. Bishop Kuka, please speak. Because speaking is not going to move, and speaking doesn't change anything, but action does.
So let me see if I can couch this. Remember the first subsidy demonstrations in 2012, where Nigerians came out to demonstrate, but by day 2, day 3, some people had to start bringing food to the demonstration points to keep them on the street. The reality is that in a country where you've got 7 out of 10 people multidimensionally poor, all their thinking energy is going to how they are going to eat food. They do not have the luxury of thinking long term. How do we solve plurality? How do we solve all these things? And the question I'm coming back to is, if we keep pushing the responsibility to Nigerians to say, stand up and fight, stand up, and they do not have, they can't. A man who's focusing on getting food does not have enough calories to be able to sit and think about the issues that would unlock the bottlenecks or the chains that hold us down as a people. And what I'm pushing here, or the thesis I'm pushing, is that there should be a group of people who get together and say, for us to move as a nation, these are the 5 levers that we must pull. Do you agree with that thesis?
I agree with you partially, but I don't agree with you from the point of view of people sitting together. Okay, the Arab Spring did not start. The Arab Spring, if you remember, was a result of a poor young man who was pushing his cart. The government, a woman seized his cart, a policewoman seized his cart. All right. And the guy says, look, first of all, it was the height of indignity that this man's dignity will be so assaulted by a woman.
A woman. Mm-hmm.
Now, you know what we had. Mohammed didn't call a seminar to say, let us revolt. Okay? It was not the result of people sitting down in a conference. What I'm saying, in effect, is that there is something to be said in favor of timing, a time whose moment has come. Let me put it that way. Mm-hmm. I can agree with you. I agree with you that structuring, designing the mechanism for a response can be and should be an elite issue. But how to disseminate that conversation in a way and manner that people can see a reflection of their interest in that mirror, that is what is most important. Because when you talk about these people that you are saying they are unable to think, well, you are living in Abuja, so you are thinking about the cost of fuel. All right, you're living in Abuja, you're thinking about the cost of buying a newspaper or buying, but for millions of Nigerians who are living in a village like mine, who are not buying fuel because they're not going anywhere, for millions of those people whose food is the food they've been eating over a long period of time, they're not interested in the intervention of the Nigerian state, except all they want is for the Nigerian state to make their farms free. Now, I'm not saying that's where they ought to be, but it is the business of us, the elite, to imagine a country, imagine a society that can be, and then figure out how to connect the dots. We're not going to solve the problem by talking. Multidimensional poverty is what it says it is. That is that poverty manifested at different levels. Now, and I'm sure that when you begin to define the whole issue of poverty, you might discover, for example, that more people are committing suicide in a place like Japan than they are committing in a village that is most poverty-stricken. If you go to a camp now and you see a woman with 6 children, one at her back, and she's still pushing other, and you say, Mama, can I take one of those 2 children away from you? She will say no, even though she doesn't know how she's going to feed the children. So we have a duty and a responsibility, and this conversation is moving in different directions precisely because we, the elite ourselves, haven't, and this is why what you're doing is so important, okay, that we have not been able to aggregate our visions to the point of figuring out how we can change this country. The result is that we are focusing on those who are governing us. But like I often say, those who are governing us are office holders. They're not necessarily people, they are in office, but they're not necessarily in power. Those who are in power may just be intellectuals sitting somewhere and thinking about how a good state can be built.
Let me ask a very practical question. So federal character was introduced as a way to ensure unity in Nigeria, but it appears to have just ossified, mediocrity to an extent. Do you think that federal character has run its course? Should it be scrapped? And if yes, what do we replace it with that can help us achieve what it was set out to achieve?
The Nigerian elite has proved itself capable of destroying any good thing that is placed before it. That is the truth. Even a question of the ideals that were conceptualized when we were talking about federal character. You know yourself that almost every country has a sense or something that resembles federal character. which is what does federal character say? It just says, let us see ourselves as if we are in a mirror. Our character was to create a country where everybody can feel, as the Constitution itself says, a sense of belonging. Unfortunately, the successive Nigerian elite overturned that idea, and a combination of the Socratic norms for over 30 years meant that by the time Nigeria returned to a democratic situation, the military had done all kinds of things in terms of the whole idea about what it was to be a permanent secretary in Nigeria had been destroyed. The whole idea of what it was to have a civil service that was based on meritocracy, all those things had been defeated. These are some of the casualties of military rule, let me put it that way. But I'm saying also that the other day, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, Harvard now has decided, okay, because I think they realize how prestigious the institution is, they've given people of African American descent 13% quota. Now, that quota does not necessarily say that your score has to be less, because people realize that we need to show what being Americans really is. In the same way that the idea, it has been destroyed for the same reason that the rules of engagement all through the Nigerian society have been systematically destroyed. So reconstructing this country, redesigning even to meet some of the ideals that those who might call the founding fathers or the writers of our constitution, the kind of things they thought about, the space is no longer there. So people are getting into government now, and they are not proud of serving Nigeria. They are proud of how many people they have been able to find jobs for in their communities. Nigeria is at best a prebendal state. So whether you remove federal character and substitute something else, we will still manifest the same tendencies. In part because the rules of engagement and the stage for engagement is not sufficiently ring-fenced, to weed out all of these things, because you need to have in place certain structures or institutions that will make sure, for example, that if you are recruiting, what is the most transparent way of knowing that those who sat for this examination really qualify to be here or there? So there's a lot in the system, but for me, it's not a question of scrapping or not scrapping. It is a question of how do we need to make these sentiments work for every Nigerian to have a sense of belonging.
Okay, so the theme of this conversation is plurality and national development. And if you, Bishop Kukah, were given a constitutional convention with, say, a 5-year mandate, so it's beyond a single tenure of a president, and full political cover to do your work, what are some of the things, maybe 3 things, 3 changes that you must insist that we do in this country to unlock many of the things that have held us down and free us to build a more united Nigeria where we can do indeed aspire for development, aspire and actually achieve development?
I think the first thing I would like to do, and it is achievable, is to make Nigeria credible, believable, and lovable. Now, how do you do that? You can do that by creating myths, in the same way that every country in the world has had to create a myth around which citizens aggregate. So, like some Asian countries, for example, don't talk about gross national product. They talk about gross national happiness. Okay? So, and so for me, the first thing would be to get every Nigerian, and the way to do it, there are many ways, but to get every Nigerian to sign on to the fact that we have a country. Once you psychologically have a sense of that ownership, the next thing, for example, will be to create a vision around that. And that vision can be an imaginary vision of greatness, which is to say that your imagination should have no finishing post. Because the reason why everybody's imagination is limited today is because if you are an Igbo person, you are a Yoruba person, you are not a Christian, you are not a Muslim, it limits how far you can fly. Now, it's to create the illusion. Yes, we have a country. This is what this country can deliver to you. The third point, in my view, will be to get every citizen to understand and to do everything that is humanly possible to say that we have a country in which anybody can travel to wherever they want to travel to. Because I'm convinced, and I may be wrong, but I'm convinced that 60% of the problems of Nigeria as we have them today is tied to the lack of infrastructure. Because if Nigerians were able to travel from Aba to Kano, if they were able to travel from Lagos to Mina or whatever at any time of day or any time of night, a lot of Nigerians will probably have a greater sense of urgency about how things should be. So for me, those would be the three things that I think I would like to do, and they are achievable in 5 years.
And what you've just shared is steeped in scholarly theory. I'm sure you know Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, that nations are imagined into existence. And I think that's what's missing in Nigeria, that we haven't had the ability to really imagine a nation into existence. And there are also other pointers, where you see nations that have grown because they had the infrastructure that connects them. America's growth, America's unity can be traced to the rail system, that connected disparate people and brought them together. So, I love the ideas you put on the table. But let's also talk a bit about some other issue that we talk about a lot in Nigeria, restructuring, right? It becomes a bit of a slogan that everybody uses and defines in their own way. What is your version of restructuring? What is it that you defend for restructuring, and what does your version of restructuring resist?
I think, first of all, this thing Plato talked about, which, what's his name? The American writer who wrote, Francis Fukuyama.
Yes.
Now, Francis Fukuyama revisits Plato's notion of themos. That is, and themos is about, I am somebody. You remember in the 60s, Jesse Jackson. I am somebody. Now, the philosophy of themos says, recognize the fact that I am somebody. And if you recognize, give me that space. 2, there is the second philosophy of what he called, isothemia. And isothemia is like, look, I would like to be like everybody else. I don't want to be circumscribed because I'm a woman. I don't want to be circumscribed because of my ethnicity. I don't want to be a society where I cannot attain what I want to attain because I am stopped at the gate for the simple reason that I have I'm speaking the wrong language, or I believe in the wrong religion, or whatever. So he says isothemia is about everybody understanding that everybody wants to be able to have an opportunity like everybody else. Of course, megalothemia, which is the whole idea that I am superior to everybody, and which is what is playing out in Nigeria. There are certain people, religions, ethnicities that believe that we are superior. The challenge still remains. How do you create an environment in which everybody can feel a sense of this is what I can achieve? I often joke, if you put a drum and you put a glass, you fill a drum with water, you fill a glass with water, which one is more full? Now, the drum is not full because each is filled according to its capacity. So the problem with the Nigerian state is its inability to remove the instruments of constraint. And let me tell you something that I think, and I don't mean disrespect. This is a country that we haven't been lucky to have some people who sat down and studied this country sufficiently when they had no political aspiration. I mean, I have a classmate at the Kennedy School. I left the Kennedy School in 2004. We are now, 22 or so 22? Years? Yeah. But he's convinced that he'll be president of America. And he's been making certain clear policy decisions. All right? Now, so what I'm saying is that we have a country where presidents don't know the length and breadth of the countries. They just have a few fixers here and there. They don't understand the cultural peculiarities of the people. They don't understand that there are certain parts of Nigeria where, if you touch somebody's dog, it's a problem. They don't understand. So this is why their capacity to imagine a Nigerian is severely constrained because they don't have the mental latitude to understand what the people, a bureau man, for example, who is sitting in Jos, or some Igbo man who is sitting somewhere, or an Ijo man who, they don't always want the same things. So an imagined community, like I said, it's a function of the quality of understanding that you have of your country and what the needs of people really are. So for me, it is that, again, I think that we have great opportunities, to build a great country, but we are scattered in such silos, and the people, you have exceptionally brilliant people. Unfortunately, you can't get to the finishing line precisely because of the constraints that we've put in place that challenge common citizenship. So for me, these are a combination of the factors, that we need to deal with. And that is why the kind of work that you are doing, which is taking the arguments, distilling them, and the next challenge is, where do you send the findings that you're making? But a job like yours, in the final analysis, is what fixes a country.
Thank you for that. And just to say to our participants, we're going to open it up for your contributions. So if you can, please use the Q&A tab to type your questions. The shorter, the better. And just type it the way you want me to read it out. I will attribute the question to you. But in another few minutes, I'll start taking questions from there. But Bishop, one of the challenges we have in Nigeria is the weight of memories. And we all carry different memories, and you alluded to it in your last comment. And one of the ways that nations have figured out to move forward is a truth and reconciliation of some sort, in some way, shape, or form. You were involved with Nigeria's attempt at that. How would you judge what we achieved from that effort? If we were to redo it today, how do we deal with the still lingering memories without reopening old wounds, but do it in a way that enables us to move the country forward?
Well, thank you very much for that question. You have my 400 and something page book, Witness to Justice, to explain some of those. But remember that, and I think for me, the failure, let me put, if I may use that expression, of Oputa Panel was that it had possibilities, but I think the government of the day got trapped in the politicking around that initiative. I think what the government just wanted to do was, let's create an impression that something is happening, because it gave traction to Mandela in South Africa. Because when we were assembled, we were asked to do our job in 3 months. Now, it took, let me, with all sense of modesty, because I had a bit of familiarity and I've been following South Africa since I was a student in the seminary. So the first person that I turned to was my friend, Dr. Kayode Fayemi, who became governor of Ekiti, because he had been very much involved in the situation in South Africa. It was he who got me the 5 or 6 or 7 volume report of the Truth Commission in South Africa that I started reading very quickly, and then convinced Justice Oputa that we've not even started yet. Oputa Panel, I see people are bringing up all kinds of views now. But even when we completed the job, and I think that given the resources that were available to us, the government didn't give us a penny. It took us a while to be able to find resources. And I can tell you, for the first 6 months of Oputa Panel, we did not receive a single penny from the government. I was the one who approached my friend then, Dr. Akwasi Aidu, who was the regional director of Ford Foundation. He was the one who he said, Father, for just coming to see me and knowing how committed you are, I've been following you, he gave us $50,000. It was with $50,000 that we started doing some things, by which time 6-7 months had already gone. So from the point of view of success, I would say that I think the government of the day wanted something, but it wanted something seriously discounted. Yes. And it also had a sense of purely putting up, it's a bit of window dressing, let the world see that is what we've done. Because guess what? Even with all that, limited as what we did was we still managed to get to a point in which many things could have been done. And maybe I should say it publicly. I remember that when President Obasanjo was writing, they were writing his speech, for which year was this? After we finished Oputa Panel. I was asked to contribute to the right, and one of the things I recommended was that the stadium here in Abuja should be named after Chief MKO Abiola. I'm talking 2000 and I'm talking 2002 or 2003. Oputa Panel finished in 2000, but I had just come back from the Kennedy School then. So that was one of the recommendations I made, and I then suggested build a monument in Ogoni land to remember Kensaro Wiwa, because my argument was that look, people react to symbols and symbolism very often. It's not the substance. Happily, President Obasanjo, for some inexplicable reason, appointed me in 2005 to try and see whether I could deal with the problem of Shell and Ogoni. That was a different school altogether. It took me 7 years to be able to bring all that together. But one of the most significant things we tried to do in Ogoni land was to build a monument. I had spoken to Archbishop Tutu, Wangari Maathai, all of that stuff. Now, things happened, but we had a wonderful opportunity, to have closed this conversation well. There was a lot that we recommended, but as I said, political exigencies and a lot of other things did not allow those things to fly, in part because, as I said, there really wasn't enough political will.
And so, let me take some questions from the participants, and I'll maybe come back to some of my questions I haven't raised yet. But there's a question from Ogedi Onyama. She said, Bishop, can we use elements of our primary and secondary school education curriculum to try to hit the reset button on these issues for future generations?
Well, absolutely. I think that is possible. We have take a kind of model that they have in Singapore, for example, where the government decides that from age 5 through to age 17 or 18, there are things in the curriculum that are across board. Now, when you look at it, things as basic as hygiene, things as basic as courtesy, things as basic as, something has gone wrong with child rearing and upbringing and so on and so forth. So I agree with you, there are things we can learn, but again, at the same time, we must also appreciate the fact that the population has bulged. Parental responsibility is perhaps far more important than just relying on the Nigerian state. So I agree but to teach your children your language, for example, you don't need the permission of the federal government to do that. To train your children to be polite or to other people, you don't need your children. You don't need a government to decide on that. And here I would like to recommend that when people feel strongly about an idea, just like she herself is saying, if you feel strongly about an idea, run with it, because you'll be shocked by how, if you start it on your street, it will get to the next street. And before some time, it will become a national issue. So yes, I agree.
So I have a question from Etemore Glover. She's the CEO of Impact Investor Foundation. Your Lordship, while the Arab Spring and the Nigeria EndSARS movement failed to yield sustained reform or accountability, a fundamental concern remains. Nigeria's elite appear compromised, and over 133 million citizens are in multi-dimensional poverty and cannot sustain long-term civic resistance. My question is, in a country where the elite are compromised and the majority are trapped in survival mode, what realistic pathway remains for Nigeria to achieve the kind of sustained, transformative change that movements like EndSARS and the Arab Spring attempted to spark?
Maybe ethnic differences, regional differences, religious differences are not necessarily such a bad thing for us in Nigeria. But they are also a challenge, because if you ask, did EndSARS go the way it went? EndSARS ended up being almost an elitist thing that took place in Lagos. And for me, one of the greatest sources of agony was that hardly any attempt was made to connect with young people from other parts of Nigeria. Now, if being on the bridge, for example, had been a metaphor, then it would have been possible to say that, okay, the young people in Kaduna who are going to participate in this EndSARS, go and occupy Kaduna Bridge, or you identify particular places so that you can spark up a national reaction. Now, the week that EndSARS happened, I received a telephone call from a journalist who was based in Kaduna, who said to me, look, we are having a conversation on EndSARS, and this conversation is purely young people from northern Nigeria. We want you to come and speak to us. It took me it was a big challenge for me to get into the conversation, but I finally got in and I spoke very briefly to them. But I was shocked to hear the kind of things that young boys from northern Nigeria were saying, not different from the young people in Lagos were saying. So the truth of the matter is that elite selfishness, so to say, has led us to we have found ourselves in a country in which elitism is not properly channeled as a vehicle for national development. The elites are only purely and simply concerned with looking after themselves and their children whom they are ferried out of the country, some with resources of state, some with other forms of resources. Now, I do not accept your argument, as I said, that somehow these 130-something million that are suffering from multidimensional poverty don't know what to do, or there's nothing that they can do. I'm saying that, as the saying goes, a 5-year-old kid on your shoulder can see what you yourself cannot see, because he has an advantage. So I think many of us have not taken upon ourselves the responsibility, that those who made the sacrifice to give us an education, those we left in the village, many of us have done very little to change their own lives. So I'm still saying that there definitely should be a method of having a conversation across board. This is the only country where, if you talk about a national demonstration, it probably will never happen. In part because the Igbos don't want to be where the Yorubas are. The Yorubas and the Igbos don't want to be where the Hausas or the Fulanis are. Or the Christians don't want to be where the Muslims are. The Muslims don't want to be where the Christians are. So every opportunity that we get, people want to take advantage. The answer, in my view, is to say we need to start crafting an elite that has enough self-confidence to walk beyond what geography, region, religion, and other obstacles are placing in our path. Because we are all the walking wounded. So the Igbos are crying, the Yorubas are crying, every ethnic group is crying and holding the other ethnic group responsible. But there's no collective decision by the elite across board to say this is what we can do differently.
Because I know we always come back to this elite consensus idea in many of these types of development discourses. How does that happen in practice? For someone who's engaged these issues for the greater part of 4 or 5 decades, I want to believe that you probably have attempted this. What were your lessons? What's the ingredient to get the elite to leave their privileges to think about this consensus that would create a bigger pie when they all seem to be chasing the slivers of the pie because they don't believe that the bigger pie can be baked?
Well, I think the first mistake we all make is to think that we want to change the world or that we want to change Nigeria. Elite conversation, again, as a Christian, I go back to, and I ask myself, why will Jesus Christ have said to his 11 apostles, take the gospel to all the ends of the earth? Now, with a lack of a sense of geography, I've often said, if I were one of the apostles of Jesus, I would ask, where is the end of the world? I could have said to Jesus, if you wanted this thing to go to the end of the world, you are the miracle worker. Why you should have escorted us? But he said, no, I will give you the Holy Spirit and it will accompany you. So the point to make, in my view, is that we have a serious lack of conviction. Okay? Too many of us are concerned with things happening in our lifetime. And yet the reality is that societies don't grow like that. So in my view, what you have started now, the tighter it is, the better. Because once you open up, I've been on many platforms, You start a platform, it sounds very revolutionary. And sooner than later, by the time you've done 2-3 weeks, the usual arguments have come up. People begin to exit, and it all falls on its face. So, in my view, elite consensus should be shy of numbers. Focus more on men and women of conviction and identify the issue that you want to change. Because for me, politics will not change Nigeria. The politicians understand that, look, some of our criticism is born out of quote unquote jealousy. You want our seat, you can't get it. That is why you're saying the things you're saying. And I think that elite consensus has to be built by a deliberate decision, okay, to go to a balcony where there isn't too much noise and so on, and to think out certain ideas about what might be, grind these ideas over a period of time, and then hopefully begin to identify who needs to hear what I'm saying. For example, in our conversation, we just assume we dismiss the members of the National Assembly. We call them rubber stamp National Assembly. It is not possible that 109 senators in Nigeria think the same way. It's not possible that 360 members of the National Assembly think the same way. So there must be a synergy, and it means a choice of people that we can work and talk with. But also have the humility to say that this change may not happen in my lifetime, but at least I am determined, or we are determined, to make a change.
Fantastic, fantastic. There's a question from Caleb Obunna, and I'm going to leave out the preamble and ask directly his question, which is there a sociological construct that makes it difficult for the middle class and educated to organize themselves to achieve meaningful progress? His premise is that the lower classes are able to organize themselves into unions, Okada riders, market men and women, but the middle class seems unable to do that. In your views, there are sociological construct that is stopping us from being able to do that?
Well, the mistake that we make, and I think Achebe addressed this issue when he was talking to the Igbo, so to say, look, don't let too many money misroad people take over leadership in Igbo land, because there's something to be said in favor of intellect. Now, I think part of the problem that we now have is that there's nothing sociological about it. It's a question of an aggregate of interests. What are the issues? Because if you ask yourself now, what are the issues that we feel strongly about wanting to change, for example? What are the issues? And if you ask that question, what you find is that all of us, this whole idea of being elite, we are all just ethnic warlords by other means, in part because the Nigerian state has not been able to expand enough to allow other areas by which people can freely express themselves. But as you're also seeing, and I think that is the way to go, younger and younger Nigerians are also demonstrating to us, and sooner than later, the whole idea of I'm the son of so-so and so, the whole idea of my father is so-so and so will become redundant. The elite can figure out, for example, if the elite decided it wants some kind of effective change across board, well, why don't these big boys get together, for example, and say, listen, I'm going to go out of my way. All of us who have decided today, instead of going to Abuja Golf Club, if you think all the people who go to Abuja Golf Club, if they decided for 1 week, we're not going to go to the club, we're not going to keep drinking all these very expensive and exotic drinks. The elites of Nigeria are different from the elite of other countries because we are largely a post-colonial elite, responding to the dictates of prebendalism, simply accumulating what we can find. My Mercedes is bigger than yours. My house is bigger than your own. Many Nigerian elite will be ashamed of themselves that their children are only schooling in Nigeria. I mean, if you go to the golf course now, you are not saying your children are in Canada, they're in America, they are here, and there. To tell somebody that your children are studying in Zaria or Kaduna or Abuja is like a failure. Now, that tells you that something is congenitally wrong with us and how we have conceptualized a sense of who we are and our obligation to our country.
Let me ask
more and more money is being taken out of this country when we are seeing that elites elsewhere are appropriating resources and bringing them to build up their own country. We are the only elite in the world. Maybe I don't want to say African elite, but if you see the Thabo Mbeki report, which has become redundant on illegal financial flows, out of Africa. That report, of course, has been overtaken. The figures quoted there have become outdated. But you ask yourself, how do you have a country that is a continent that is hemorrhaging so badly financially? Because the whole problems we have created, our inability to have electricity, to have roads, to have all of these things, is tied to the wrong elite decisions and the lack of commitment by an elite that doesn't have vision except the vision of appropriation.
I wasn't sure I was going to ask this question from one of our participants, but you mentioned electricity, so maybe I should. It's a mischievous question. His name is Peter Michael, and his question is, the British built railways for us, and we destroyed them when they left. We barely put 4,000 megawatts into the national grid for a population of more than 200 million Nigerians. Given the South African situation, where they are quite developed because the white refused to go, my Lord Bishop, would you have preferred if our colonial master stayed a little longer, given the present Nigerian condition? I told you it was mischievous.
Well, I mean, colonialism is not, we can lament about its ills and its evil. But I think really the very fact that Nigerians are contemplating either a better time or whatever with colonialism is a tragedy, but it also tells you the reason why we are where we are. But these are not choices that we were free to make. Other people had a bit of power. They knew what they knew. They came and they colonized us. But also, without colonialism, we will not be speaking English today. You and I will not be communicating today. It's a question of the ability to choose between what we can change and what we cannot change. Again, I still want to make the point because I'm convinced that, frankly, it's important for us to think about it. And I'm not talking of good soldiers or bad soldiers, but that really, really, had we not had military intervention over the period of time that we had it, I think this country would have achieved quite a lot, because the whole idea that military rule coincided with oil money and the collapse of the civil service, with civil servants gradually sensing that theirs was a case of monkey they walk, baboon they chop. So many civil servants, then as now, have decided they are contractors by other means. They are doing all kinds of things because they said, why will we be the ones working and then others who are enjoying are different? The period of time that you require to put down the kind of infrastructure that can contain the anger, the frustration, the excitement of 150, 200, 250 million Nigerians, that time frame we haven't got. Because it will take a minimum of about, except if you have a country of 10 million people, because Nigeria is not Singapore. Many other countries are about just a local government in Nigeria. They're also culturally homogeneous. And also, can you imagine what Nigeria would have been today if the whole of northern Nigeria had embraced Western education? And that all these people we are calling almajiris, you are 25 or 30 million young people roaring to go. Now, the fact that the percentage of those who are educated in Nigeria is not that significant tells you that we are living in two countries, because if you take the North it is a country of its own, so to say, because of the negative indices that it is posting in almost every social index, or human development index. And you can argue, if you go to many parts of Igbo land, especially where I've traveled very often to, you can see that many Igbo towns and many towns in the south are so developed, the result of the work of individuals. It is only in northern Nigeria that after you've left the city, there's very little else to look at. So you can imagine what would have happened if Awolowo was educational program, or even if Shagari's and Obasanjo's educational programs had come on stream. And people didn't go around discouraging children and saying to them that if you get education, you are going to stop being a Muslim and so forth. So we must be a bit measured, because the capacity of people to participate in the development of their own dreams and vision is severely limited by lack of education.
Yeah. I have a question from Ejike Madu. Feudalism and capitalism are competing against each other in Nigeria. He says that in some literature, this is seen as the bane of development in Nigeria. He would like you to speak to that. And I know you already spent a bit of time on that, but maybe just unpack it a little bit.
You know, my friend the Sultan made an observation some years back, you know, when he addressed traditional rulers, because many of them, he said to them, if any traditional ruler uses his office, you know, to shield a corrupt person, you'll have to carry your cross yourself. Now, as I say, traditional institutions, we are still calling them traditional institutions. But as we know, when you talk about the traditional institution today, we talk about subjects, and people say, oh, they are nearer to the people. The society has become so sophisticated now. There's no traditional ruler who can say he has control of his people, because the truth of the matter is that with the social media, with people's ability to communicate and so on, things have changed tremendously. My argument still remains that the slow national development in Nigeria is what has pushed us back to where we now find ourselves. Because I can tell you, as long as Nigeria remains undeveloped, so long with non-state actors, whether they are traditional rulers or bishops, remain quote unquote relevant. And I mean relevant in a measured term. Once you open up a country, I mean, if you go to, let's say, if you are a citizen in the United States of America, what kind of quote unquote yanga are you going to make over the car that you are driving? Really? All right. It is, where will you go to that you say that you have this amount of money in your account and you cannot tell where it came from? So, and the added part of this conversation about corruption is that we are still handling money by hand. Let me put it that way. In reality, the more science develops, the more technology develops, the less corruption gets the upper hand. But right now, we have a higher percentage of our people unable to access the tools and instruments of modernity. So it's not a question of either or. In my view, it is that Nigeria is stuck facing all these problems, whether it is banditry, whether it is kidnapping, because you ask yourself, where in the world can you say that you've kidnapped 100 people and nobody is able to tell where these 100 people are? Or 500 people, and you're not able to say you know where they are? With the size of America, for example, how many goats can run out on the Arizona desert without being
yeah.
You know, for me, and we have a country where the government admits that 60% of the land mass is ungoverned. That means that you're literally at best at the mercy of bandits. And this is what we are reaping today. So these are some of the issues why Nigerians are gradually losing faith and unwilling and unable to make contributions. Because if you create the condition for Nigerians, even a fraction of Nigerians, to have the confidence to come back to their country and help to develop this country, every person with resources and talents feels unwilling to come and contribute in Nigeria because the environment they perceive is hostile, is nepotistic, is not favorable to being able to appreciate the resources that they have. And yet everywhere else, it is diaspora people that have helped to change, the development and face of their countries.
Sure. So Bishop, we've got about 10 minutes to go, but 10 other very interesting questions. So let me see if we can get through a lot of them with slightly shorter responses. There's a question from Obeyemi. He says, Bishop, what do you think might trigger a form of liberation theology in the Nigerian church?
Well, liberation theology is actually redundant now. When people talk about liberation theology, I said it was the liberation of theology. Because, the liberation of theology is actually a reinterpretation of what the gospel really talks about. So again, we are trying to borrow texts from other countries. We can't talk about liberation theology in Nigeria because we are not as culturally or religiously homogeneous as the people in Latin America were. We are dealing with countries that were 90% Christian. So they could have a message in that. I think what we can do and say about Nigeria is we just have to continue to grind and grind and grind and improving our environment without looking for a quick fix solution, because it doesn't exist anywhere.
There's a question from some anonymous, or at least it comes up as anonymous. He says, the Catholic Bishop of Makurdi has maintained the genocide framing, grounding it in specific institutional losses, including 17 parishes shut down as of June 2025. He has not shifted nor needed a clarification. His question is, by what stable definition of genocide can your October affirmation and your November rejection both be presented as consistent rather than contradictory?
Well, look, the interesting thing about I don't know what he talks about my October, because my October presentation actually is on the internet and you can read it. And one of the things I said in my presentation in Rome was, I admitted, I said, we are victims of language. And by whatever, English is not our mother tongue. So by whatever name we want to give it, whether we want to call it genocide, whether we want to call it suicide, whether we want to call it fratricide, the important thing is that Nigerians are dying. And by all means, these killings should stop. I don't live in Makurdi. Whatever you want to call it, whether it's genocide or whatever, we want the killings to stop. The Bishop of Makurdi or the Bishop of Lokoja, the Bishop of anywhere will have to speak based on their direct experience. They are going through attacks by militias that they can identify. These killings are targeted. And I have said people are losing their lands. They are losing their homes. My argument was, that is one narrative. The second narrative is that where I am in Sokoto, my conversation is different. I'm experiencing what you may call, whether it's persecution, but it's not of the same, the context is not the same. And I can't understand why Nigerians try to make something out of the fact that maybe the Bishop of Makurdi and myself are holding different positions. Now, the good news, there is nothing I said then and now that is different from what the Holy Father has said. There's nothing I've said then and now that is different from what the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Nigeria has said, which is that our people are dying and the killings must stop. Now, those who take the other narrative are insisting that we're only dying as Christians. And I said, yes, there was a time, okay, but right now we are in a situation in which everybody is dying without any denominational consideration. And for me, I just say, let's not become hostages to distractions. Let me put it that way, because in the final analysis, whether it's genocide, by whatever name it is, people are still dying and they've not stopped dying. People are still being kidnapped. They've not stopped being kidnapped. So I'm just saying, let's end all of this by whatever means possible.
Sure. There's a question from Ndumokolo. He's a partner with Next Year. He says, Bishop, the unity of a state is often negotiated. Isn't this part of what is missing in our state formation? And if it is, how do we achieve this? I added a component to his question by saying, how can we negotiate our unity if we don't have a provision for a referendum?
Look, for me, the truth, I don't know, as I see it, I think the idea of unity is become redundant. The expression itself is a bit of an oxymoron, because unite for what? Unity by whom? We are now, the world has changed so significantly, all right? Many of us belong to different citizenships and so on. So if you talk about the Igbos uniting, or the Yorubas uniting, or the Ijos uniting, it is uniting to do what? Largely because in many of our communities or many families today, people are in different parts of the world, enjoying different citizenships and so on and so forth. I think what we should focus on is a unity of, let's be united that we want to keep our country safe. Okay? People will always go wherever they can find opportunities. Right now, Nigeria in particular, and Africa in general, have become severely constricted spaces, too dangerous for young people to thrive the way they will want to thrive. If you don't deliberately plan and plot to remove those obstacles, to make it possible for people to feel that they can be what they want to be without having to pander to a politician. I remember two young men, my friend's children, When they called to tell me they had just graduated from the United States, I said, so when are you coming back home? They said to me, Uncle Bishop, we don't have we don't have a relation who is a senator. So what are we coming home to Nigeria to do? So for me, these are the issues. The idea of unity, it was a rallying point in the 50s and the 60s. That is because the percentage of educated people was not very significant. So we are looking for leaders. Right now, nobody is looking for a leader in the world. People are just looking for facilitators, people who will facilitate an opportunity for them to be what they want to be.
You, earlier in our conversation, you talked about, creating imagined communities, creating a myth, a national myth as a way to help us chase this big thing about national development. If a president called you today and she wanted a plan on how to create this myth, have you given thought to it? If yes, can you just take a few minutes to walk us through some of the things that can be done to create this myth that can bring us together to fight for development?
I think the first thing to do would be to destroy the foundations, the false foundation of our differences, okay, which have become walls that are keeping us away from one another. Yesterday, the vice president delivered a very brilliant speech at the launch of the book by General Gawan. And he said some very interesting things. They were largely provocative, quite all right. When he said, look, the Biron person and the Fulani look alike. And he jokingly said, look, if you take a picture of the Sultan of Sokoto and you take the picture of the Bongbong of Jos, who is a Biron man, you would think that they look alike. Now, and he talked about, he said, I'm a Kanuri man. As long as we're still talking about we Igbos, we Yorubas, we this, that, and the other, we're making the project difficult. So in my view, the first thing will be to imagine how we can make ourselves Nigerians, not by declaration. And a lot of those, because you can see when Nigerians congregate around the super eagles, there must be, they want to see evidence of success. If you begin to create institutions and even structures, whether it's a stadium, whether it's a 20 or 30-story building in Abuja. One of my disappointments in Abuja with the design of the city is that it doesn't have a good skyline, So for me, there are a lot of imaginary things you can do. Even if you decided to build a 1,000 or 3,000 feet tower in every city, for example, because as you can see, you go to London, people's views of London has changed since the London Eye, for example. Because people go to New York, they want to go and see. So you can create all kinds of images around different parts of the country. And these things can begin to inspire confidence, in citizens. There are a lot of things that are possible that can be done. But you have to put that down as a project, which means you have to now begin to look for people like our friend, the fantastic Chukwu Merije, for example. All of these poets and all these writers. When I spoke at Wole Soyinka's 80th birthday, one of the things I said was that Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, that first generation of writers gave us art imitating life. And that is why when you read any of these novels, you can always find somebody that looks like somebody in your village, whether it's an Okonko or whatever. But I say the next challenge for Nigerian writers now is to make art imitate life. I mean, yes, to make life imitate art.
And so, Bishop, we've really run out of time, but maybe just this last question and you can use it to wrap up. When you look at the generation of Nigerians now in their 20s and maybe early 30s, what do they understand about plurality that their parents did not? And what do they need to yet understand?
Well, I think I envy this generation. They are better skilled. They are not hamstrung by the things that are holding us together. They're not busy debating whether I'm Igbo or whether I'm Yoruba or whatever. I think they've scaled that fence. All they are probably comparing their telephones and so on, but they're also comparing notes in terms of the opportunities and what they can do with their cell phones or their computers. So to that extent, I think that this generation is going to face the prospects of a de-escalated sense of ethnicity and geography and so on. But perhaps even more importantly, one of the missing things, of course, for this generation is a lack of proper understanding of cultural history and where we as Africans, have come from and where we are today. Their challenges will be completely different from our own challenges, but they have a better opportunity, to think of a world that we can only dream of.
And Bishop Kuka, I mean, thank you so much for your generosity and candor with this conversation. It's one that has been begging us to have for a long time. And it's one I hope, even if it's not for this generation, for the generation that's coming behind us, to take forward and see if we can build a nation that works for everyone and where we can convert plurality from a liability to an asset. For that, I thank you so much, Bishop, for making time for this conversation.
Thank you very much. You have still not congratulated me for Arsenal's victory.
And I congratulate you for Arsenal's victory after 22 years.
Thank you. It doesn't matter. Time is behind us. Thank you, Patrick. God bless you. And thank you, everybody. Thank you. God bless you.
And for everybody who joined today, thank you so much. And let's keep building that society we want to live in.